Honourable Member for Guelph.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since Confederation and leading up to it, Canada has served as a land of opportunity and hope for generations of immigrants who, from every corner of the globe, seek a better life for themselves and have even greater aspirations for their children. Together, new Canadians and longtime citizens have worked cooperatively to build communities and to build a country that is second to none and that is a model for the world. Canada's distinction, uniqueness, strength, and success are drawn in part from the cultural wealth arising from the diversity of all of its citizens. It is from that strength that we have built a country that is indeed immeasurably greater than any particular region, province, culture, or group within it. Just as the measure of a person is how they treat others around them, stranger or not, fundamentally the measure of a country is how it deals with those men and women who seek refuge from poverty and violence, persecution and oppression, who arrive on our shores. As parliamentarians, it falls on us to make the rules that determine how these men, women, and children are received. And as a parliamentarian, it does well to be reminded that there are episodes in our past where we approach those seeking refuge in a manner that was misguided and wrong. Incidents like the Komagata Maru in 1914 and the SS St. Louis during the Second World War resulted in refugees being forced to return to an almost certain persecution and, in far too many cases, death. Generations before them, we dealt poorly with the Chinese, imposing a head tax and then an outright ban on immigration, only lifted in 1947. It is incumbent upon us to not make the same mistakes that generations of lawmakers before us made. That is why the legislation before us demands serious reconsideration. This bill, despite its stated intention to cut down on human smugglers, fails to do so and instead targets legitimate refugee claimants. The mechanism exists already under the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act to penalize an individual found to be engaged in human smuggling. As it stands, a human smuggler faces up to $1 million in fines and a maximum of life imprisonment for smuggling more than 10 people into Canada. Yet earlier this week, the Minister of Immigration characterized the bill as a disincentive for human smugglers. I fail to see how this bill accomplishes that goal if the prospect of life imprisonment and a $1 million fine does not. By granting the Minister of Public Safety the all-too broad discretion to designate the arrival of a certain group of refugees as a, quote, human smuggling event or an irregular arrival, subject to a mandatory one-year detention, the government opens up any arrival of 2 refugees or more to be a potential crisis. Once again, experts decry the move toward mandatory detention as not only ineffective, but also likely illegal. This government insists that it requires the time to determine the identity and admissibility and investigate illegal activity. However, existing statutes provide ample time for immigration officials to make these determinations. Yet again, this is an example of a government that refuses to deal with the complexities of a given situation, of a government that refuses to see any issue any other way than in black or white. Much like its misguided mandatory minimum provisions in the Omnibus Justice Bill, it is attempting to force through the House. The solution this government has arrived at is to detain and incarcerate that which it cannot understand. Further to mandatory detention, this bill will restrict designated refugee claimants from making an appeal on humanitarian or compassionate grounds for 5 years, or from appealing to the new Refugee Appeal Division. This legislation will surely be challenged. The appeal process exists for a reason. Humanitarian and compassionate applications are meant to catch those cases that fall through the cracks of our legal system. Yet if a refugee claim is found to be legitimate, this government still intends to produce more hoops to jump through, including a provision that bans a refugee from applying for permanent residency for 5 years after arriving. Not only is this provision a clear violation of the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees, as it refuses the right to assimilation and naturalization, but it is the cruel act of a government saying to someone who has already endured significant hardship, you could stay and work to support yourself and your family and pay taxes and contribute to society, but at any moment we could decide to send you home if we feel like it. And also, by the way, you can't leave or you have to stay out. That doesn't perpetuate loyalty, Mr. Speaker. It perpetuates resentment. This from the same government that cut $53 million in funding to immigration settlement services across Ontario just before Christmas last year. Guelph is a gateway community in Canada. 21% of residents of Guelph consider themselves an immigrant. Last week, I attended the annual general meeting of Guelph Settlement Services Centre. This is an organization that provides numerous programs to facilitate speedy integration of new immigrants into our community. And it had 15% of its budget needlessly cut by a government that really doesn't understand the new face of Canada. This year we watched as 492 Sri Lankan Tamil refugee claimants landed off our west coast. Barely a year before that, Canadians watched as a civil war tore apart that country. We watched incidents of terrorism and saw the squalor of poverty brought on by massive instability. 492 men, women, and children packed themselves into a boat that was little more than a floating cargo hold and set out across the Pacific Ocean. There was little better about their accommodations for those months on the boat than the country they left for a better life. There was illness and death, but they came anyway. Many of those refugees are still in detention, but there is no doubt that even the past year in prison here in Canada has been better than the wreckage of Sri Lanka. If you don't believe me, I would refer you to the comments of the Minister of Public Safety yesterday when he said, during our debate on the Justice Omnibus Bill, the Minister implied that often foreign prisoners would much prefer incarceration in Canadian jails than their own home countries, and by extension would prefer detention in Canada to any refugee camp in the world. So really, there is no disincentive in this bill to those who are seeking refuge here in Canada, and even less for the real criminals in this situation, human smugglers. In the face of an uncertain world, with increasing costs of food causing global unrest and climate change creating even larger displacements of peoples from African and other countries, refugee claims will only increase. Already we need measures much more creative than what is in this bill. Instead of legislation designed to satisfy a small, though vocal base by ideological legislation that looks tough but accomplishes nothing, Canada needs to begin looking to bigger and longer-term solutions. We need to engage internationally in programs to deal with immigration and refugees. Human smuggling is a scourge that will only get worse if we don't actually combat human smugglers instead of penalizing refugees. As a maritime country, we are a natural destination for boatloads of displaced immigrants. Efforts at the UN with both maritime and non-maritime countries will need to be undertaken to assure that all nations assume their responsibility to help refugee claimants. Just as we need to be smarter on crime, we especially need to be smarter on immigration. Canada is a beacon of light for people around the world. We cannot shut our doors and turn our backs on men and women, families seeking a better life. But we also cannot allow criminals to take advantage of this system and make money off of refugees who are only looking to escape persecution, violence, and oppression. This bill is not the right answer to what will be a defining issue, Mr. Speaker, for many years to come. Thank you so much.
Questions and comments?
Very much for the question, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you're quite right. There's already penalties for human smugglers. $1 million fine, up to life imprisonment. And what do? They demonize and vilify people who are trying to escape those circumstances which are a direct threat to their health, their safety, and their very lives. But those people, as I said in my remarks, may well be willing to spend a year in detention rather than face those circumstances. So in fact, this legislation isn't really meant to deter people from coming here. It's not going to deter people from coming here. What it is really meant to do is provide cosmetic window dressing to their base so that Canada, and particularly their base, thinks that they're doing something about this problem. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member, l'honorable député de Lac.
Thank you very much for the question. Mr. Speaker, in answer to the first question, the fact of the matter is that this government actually refuses to apply the proper resources to deal with matters of immigration and, frankly, to deal with matters of refugee claims. We're now up to 1 million people trying to get into this country. 1 million people. And that was about 700,000 several years ago. So they're clearly not interested in helping immigrants get to this country. In answer to the second question, it's like their crime bill. People who are about to commit an offense don't open the criminal code and think to themselves, oh, I might have to spend some time in jail if I commit this crime. They don't think that way. And similarly, Mr. Speaker, people who are trying to escape circumstances that are a threat to their life are not going to look at our immigration laws to see how they will be treated if they get here. They will escape, and they will go to a country that they consider to have a reputation that's welcoming and inviting and presents a future for they and their children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For a short question and response, the honourable member for Guelph.
Thank you for that question from my friend. Mr. Speaker, I agree absolutely with the premise of the question. It's in violation of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's in violation of Supreme Court law. It's in violation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Refugees. I have no doubt that this legislation will be successfully challenged once it's passed by this government. Thank you.
Resuming debate.